All right, well, let's begin. Apparently, the order of the sequence in which your visuals show up is different for everybody. So let's just go around and say, what is your name? Where are you? And what's the weather like where you are this evening or this morning? Nadine, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Nadine Bell in Dallas, Texas. And it's beginning to get cold for us. That means we're going under 40. And I'm complete.
Thank you. Someone else.
Ellen Howie in Altamont, New York, and we're down to 0 tonight, so it finally feels like winter. Feels good. There's a fire in the fireplace.
Great. Thank you. Dharma?
I'm in Johor Bahru, Malaysia. We've had a week or more of rain and quite cool. Today is bright and sunny, and it's pleasant.
Thank you. Paul?
This is Paul Noah. I'm in Northfield, Minnesota, and the weather today is was below freezing this morning, and all the trees and everything were covered with frost. So,
Thank you.
I'm complete.
Karen?
Karen from in Melbourne, Australia. It's bright and sunny, blue skies here at the moment. It's about 24 degrees, I think, today, maximum Celsius.
Thank you. Jim?
I'm in Towson, Arizona, and it's raining.
And I'm John in Denver, where it's clear and about 45 today. Now, let's get on and get started. This is chapter 5 is about action, and it's following up on his work on the integral ecology. Now he's going into what needs to be done about this. And that's a different question from what should I do? It's more like what needs to be done, and it's a bit different. What caught your attention about this chapter? Anyone?
He talks
This
about
is Go ahead, please.
in
The word dialogue gets mentioned a lot, Karen. Over.
What word, please?
Dialogue.
Jim, it feels like a huge brainstorm. We should do this and this and this, and there's this to think about, and we ought to think about this, and don't forget about that. And I think really this ought to be considered in like a long laundry list. And I'm complete.
Ellen here, paragraph 172, he talks about there being primarily ethical decisions rooted in solidarity between all peoples. I'm complete.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was caught by his early in the chapter talking about interdependence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. Then he goes on to talk about a global consensus is essential.
Yeah. In a chapter on action, why do you suppose he says dialogue is a major action? When you had dialogue in every part of this, is he just out for a lot of talking?
Sorry, Karen here. My understanding of that is the building of the global consensus. Part and parcel to what he says needs to happen is a global consensus about our direction, about what we should be doing. And in order to achieve that, we need to have dialogue between science and religion and between all different faiths and including all different peoples. Over.
Thank you. Someone else, what do you make of his push for dialogue?
Dharma here again. Dharma here again. The earlier chapters he was talking about, is trying to explain all the things involved with climate warming and so forth. But here he does get into the whole issue that that we just need to talk it through. And I mean, so it's really, this entire chapter is about the discussions needed across the globe and among the various sectors. And it's very heavy about that, on that, you know, that decisions have to be made, and it's coming at it from that angle. I'm done.
Yeah, it's not like he's got an answer or the answer. It's like he's suggesting that all various perspectives get included in the decision making. At least that's the way I read it. One other thing that struck me about it, as you might have noticed from the chart, he's got 3 beats on the political and 1 each on the economic and 1 on the cultural. What do you make of that? Why is he coming down so hard on the political?
Ellen here in paragraph 173 is talking about the need for global regulatory norms. So how that can be achieved certainly seems to me like a political arena. And then, you know, having some teeth in those norms if people don't live up to them. Unacceptable actions, he says here.
Mm-hmm. He talks in 175, getting on to the segment on the international community, that there's a weakening power of nation states because the economic tends to prevail. That's not a real surprise. We've known that since we developed the social process triangle and analysis of the imbalance. But where do you see that? Where do you see evidence of the weakening power of nation states because of economic control?
Yeah, I was thinking of the whole controversy over this, the Trans-Pacific, the TPPA, the Trans-Pacific, forgot the long form of it. But it was basically the trade agreement that Obama has been pushing for various nations in Southeast Asia, and I think it includes Chile and others. And there's been a lot of controversy because of the secrecy in which that entire agreement has been concluded. And you know, those who oppose it say, well, it's, you know, the whole thing is written with multinationals being privy to the clauses that go in, and the people of these nations are not privy to it. And to me, that reflects this very point that he's making, that the economic and financial sectors, being transnational, have a power. So, you know, this one case, which is, you know, very, very clear how various nation states are weakened because of the clout that the transnationals have.
Yeah. Anyone else have some experience of that, or illustration of the weakening power of nation states?
This is
Okay,
Dave
well,
Rebstock. This is Dave Rebstock. I think any country that doesn't have their own source of energy or has to depend on someone else to extract their energy is at a disadvantage economically. And that's just one resource. But a good example is when we lived in Jamaica. Jamaica's main economic driver is tourism. But all the tourism, the people buy all their tickets in the United States, and all the money goes to the bank in the United States. So it never even goes to Jamaica. And the only money that goes to Jamaica is to pay the salaries and pay the money for the hotels and that sort of thing. But all the money for the cruise ships, all the money for the hotels, transportation, everything comes to the United States or England. And that's true of an awful lot of economic advantages of the resources of given nation states. They're controlled by the West or by some other country like Russia. I'm complete.
Then he says in paragraph 175 again, which is sort of seems to me a loaded phrase. He says there's an urgent need for a true world political authority. I mean, people I talk with often think a world political authority is a bad word, something to be feared. What are some of the objections that would have to be addressed for there to be true world political authority? Hello, David Carlson.
Hello, John. Sorry I'm late. I was
Welcome.
recycling.
For the rest of you, David is the one who submitted that two-page paper I sent out of the summary of this. So you're very welcome.
Okay, thank you, John.
Good.
Glad to be here.
Now, the urgent need for a true world political authority. What are the objections people have to a true world political authority?
One of our presidential hopefuls, Hillary Clinton, had a little schema where she says that that in the 1800s we realized we got rid of slavery. In the 1900s, we got rid of totalitarianism. Anyway, in the 1900s, we realized that totalitarianism wasn't going to work. We shouldn't go that direction. And in the 21st century, in the 2000s, it was going to focus on the rights of women. So I don't know that anybody has an image of a world political authority that wouldn't be a form of totalitarianism. And I guess, China is still sort of working that way, but it's hard to, I don't, like the last chapter where he used a lot of words about an integral ecology, but pointed out we just don't have a vision. We don't have a picture of what that would be like. I don't think anybody's got a picture of what this would be like that would work. Plus, right now, I think we're also aware of what happens behind the scenes of any political authority, as to not particularly believe that would work. And I'm complete.
I have the same feelings too. How can a true world political authority come into being? I'm thinking of the United Nations, but then the United Nations always, the Secretary General has to have the blessings of the US and, basically the blessings of the US before he's, in fact, made that. I guess the Security Council, but then it only includes a few of the big powers. And I mean, I do think that, yes, you do need some kind of an authority to be able to enforce certain kind of decisions, because earlier in the chapter, he does talk about how countries place their national interests above world interests. So you need that, but I just don't see how it's going to happen, you know, what form it'll happen.
Yeah, it's puzzling because in Malaysia, the smog coming from Indonesia is there's no enforcement mechanism whatsoever, and yet Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia all suffer from it, but there's nothing anybody seems able to do about it. So that's
This is Jim. I wonder if that's not it. And I'm again reflecting on Dharma's comments from our last study. All of this is world-centric. It may be that the true world political authority that's emerging is CO2 concentrations. And the way it's taking charge is by sending smog regardless of boundaries, changing weather patterns regardless of boundaries, and we'll see what else.
John, you asked what are some of the objections that have to be addressed if we agree that a global council is needed. I agree that it's needed. I think some of the objections, it's about the mandate. So it's about generating a consensus that everybody agrees is the consensus and agrees that that is the mandate, and we want to put that mandate in the hands of a global authority. And so I also agree with Jim that nobody yet has a concept of what that might look like. But to me, it's dependent on that global consensus and mandate. Over.
well. Let's take a few minutes and just imagine a bit. What would it look like? What would be some characteristics of a true world political authority that would help us achieve and enforce environmental sensitivity? What would be some aspects of it?
Ellen here. I think that minority views would have to be respected, and people would have to feel that they would be listened to.
Okay, good.
I'm complete.
Would be some other characteristics of an authority that would help us address this global climate crisis.
Well, this is Jim. There would have to be the capacity for generating consensus, or the continuous generation of consensus around mandates, and some mechanism that that avoided simply how do I say this? That avoided simply hopping on the next issue. I mean, if you get on social media, we've gotten pretty good at thoughts and ideas and information whizzing around the world pretty quickly, and people liking or not liking or picking up on things. So that part, I think, is sort of in place, but then there's got to be a way of a foundation of certain, continuing to work on certain solidifying things, because I think the issue of response to climate change is really, it's really more of an engineering issue than it is anything else. It's figuring stuff out that will work and shifting ways of operating and innovations that'll that'll work. So I guess that's the other piece. It's got to be something that enhances the sense of trying things out in dialogue and avoids paralysis of regulation. And I'm complete.
Somewhere between enforcing a particular mandate that may not be appropriate everywhere and then doing nothing. Somewhere between there, it's got to operate. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would have to have various areas specified, like conventions on biodiversity, conventions on fossil fuels and emissions. It would require that all of the nations would have to have signed up to it, so that they would be what shall I say? They would have to abide by whatever rulings come out. I'm thinking of the International Criminal Court, for instance, in Europe, and the U.S. hasn't signed up to it, and so the U.S. can always evade that, and so that makes that court weakens the power. It's not really an international court. So you would need whatever this authority would be. I think it should be very much focused on certain laws governing certain areas. It should have the power to name and shame, so to speak, and it should have. I mean, I'm thinking of how important laws are for various multinationals, and they are, and then they make sure they get the laws right, so that, because the minute you break them, that treaties and all of that becomes invalid. So you've got to have that kind of legal basis as well, which will bring the area of enforcement to all of these things. So those things all should have to be part of the whatever this authority is. I'm done.
Jim, you made the comment that the Pope does not offer a vision in chapter 4, where he discusses integral ecology. This is Dave Carlson. I'm a newbie to this discussion. I would suggest that his vision of a civilization of love does provide at least an image of what that might look like. And as I write, or as I have written in a paper that's going to be coming out later this month, a civilization of love is not based upon a cuddly feelings for each other. Rather, such a civilization entails social and political love. Pope writes, economics without politics cannot be justified, since this would make it impossible to favor other ways of handling the various aspects of the present crisis. That goes to the point that was made in some of the overview remarks, John, that you made, that politics gets 3 beats and economics and culture gets 1 beat each. I would say the Pope is in sync with your overview remarks. So we might envision, or we might discuss for a bit, what does this civilization of love look like? Is that just a pipe dream? Is that just, the Pope's rhetoric? I don't think so. I think it's more.
Thanks, John. Karen here. Just before we turn to that, what would the civilization of love look like? I think an example of where we've made leaps and bounds in terms of international agreements and things that we've signed up to. And we had the Climate Council meeting that in Copenhagen, they just could not come to any consensus, and everybody left feeling frustrated that they hadn't agreed on anything. And then just recently, I can't remember which month, but 2015, and I can't remember which city, one of you may remember, we did all sign up to something really important. We've all got quotas, and it's nothing like what Francis is recommending. We haven't got there yet, but the distance that we've come in the last 3 years in terms of international agreements is pretty positive in terms of at least loving our environment, if not a loving society. Over.
Thank you. David, let's go back to your question. You said, what are some, help me phrase it again, a civilization of love, what might it look like? Was that the way you asked the question?
Yes. And in the encyclical, the Pope does offer some concrete images. Let's take his discussion of sustainable development. That's such a ubiquitous buzzword or buzz phrase. The World Trade Organization embraces sustainable development. The UN, of course, its latest development goals are really using that language. In chapter 4, the Pope goes beyond the usual discussion of the social, economic, and political dimensions of sustainable development to talk about the cultural ecology and the ordinary life in neighborhoods and so on. He's talking about the ecology of a place, we could call it. Yes, I think a very thoughtful discussion about how that can start at the lowest possible level, the level of neighborhoods. I see it emerging from the bottom up, not so much top down. And I agree with the comments of the woman who just spoke about the progress in the last 3 years and the recent accord signed or to be signed in Paris, or developed in Paris and to be signed in April, as I understand. There is a panoply, a cornucopia of actions being taken at local, state, regional, national levels, and it could blossom in unexpected ways. I see that more likely than, say, a UN kind of top-down approach. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, or whatever Mao's a slogan comes to mind.
Yeah, he goes on to get away from that top-down approach business by going to the national and local level next. I was going to ask, if you were the head of this global institution he's opting for, what's one thing you might do?
And Howie here. I'm looking at back in chapter 4 at paragraph 160 and the existential questions that he would have us explore. What is the purpose of our life in this world? Why are we here? What is the goal of our work and all our efforts? And what need does the earth have of us? So it's almost not only asking us as persons or as communities to reflect upon those existential questions, but I think that he personifies the earth, that he points to the earth. At some other point in the book, he talked about the suffering of the earth itself. And so, I think about the kinds of courses and programs that the Institute of Cultural Affairs has done in the past, where very often we're looking at those kinds of questions. But I think that that would be certainly a way to begin if you're looking at the whole issue of love and on a macro level. I'm complete.
He says in the last two sentences of paragraph 178, true statecraft is manifest when in difficult times we uphold high principles and think of the long-term common good. Political powers do not find it easy to assume this duty in the work of nation building. So he's, to use our three categories, he's calling on the cultural to be the guiding principle to any kind of statecraft. And I think that's where the love part would come in, David. But then he says in 179, local individuals and groups can make a real difference. Now, I remember in 1979, we did a study of Thomas Friedman's Hot, Flat, and Crowded. And he seemed to say that the green movement was more a fad than a movement. It certainly wasn't a revolution, because in revolutions, people get hurt, and nobody was hurting. In this particular movement, he thought it was a green party rather than a green revolution. Where do you see some local and individual groups making a real difference?
Here in Ellen Howie here. Here in New York State, we have the conservancy community where people are able to put their land into a conservancy so that in perpetuity it does not get developed.
Hmm. Yes, I guess in Boulder, Colorado, they have a lot of land that's set aside as open space.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other examples of this?
Aaron,
One illustration from one powerful example for me is going on in the rural part of Oaxaca, Mexico. College classmates of over 50 years ago have been working with indigenous communities there to reinforce self-sufficiency, care for the land, a communitarian spirit as a signal, really a shining light as to a radically different way to relate to the land. The book that captures much of this interplay between a critique of neoliberal economics and the pernicious effects of NAFTA, the International Trade Agreement, Canada, Mexico, and the U.S., with vibrant images of village life where farmers, small-scale farmers, are helping each other in planting and harvesting. It really gives new imagery to connectedness. And I'd like to bring that word into the conversation, relatedness. We now have the ability of connecting. Well, this conference call, this podcast or whatever it is, it illustrates it beautifully. that these local initiatives that are happening around the world no longer need to happen in isolation, in ignorance of each other.
Yeah.
And I think that is a more likely path than a top-down one.
Thank you. Oh, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the local co-op grocery here in Northfield that is was the #1 business in town now after about 10 years that they had people put money into it and bought shares in the operation, and all of that has now been paid back. And so they're going into this profit mode and going into an expansion. And people are really excited about. And you go in there and there's just lively conversation and a lot of talk and explanation about the natural products and the local producers of the farms around. It's just very exciting to go shopping.
Thank you. You know, we have a client in Singapore that we had been away from for 7 or 8 years, and then he called us back in this year. And he's an air conditioning repair company. And they have transferred that to be an energy conservation company. So they retrofit buildings to save energy. And they figured, and their average is they can save $400,000 a year in energy costs from companies by cleaning up their ventilation system and replacing light bulbs and taking care of ventilation and so forth. And the way he's paid is from the savings, a percentage of the savings of energy. The company doesn't outlay anything up front, but when they start making their savings, the company gets part of his client. The aircon company gets a portion of that income. So it's really taken off in Singapore, and it's promising. I'm just amazed that that much energy is normally wasted, but this is a local company, fairly small, that's making a real difference.
This is Dharma here. I'm thinking in Malaysia, the whole issue of political corruption is a big one. And currently our prime minister, who recently played golf with Obama, is accused of siphoning off $1.8 billion into his personal account. And he just refuses to admit it. He controls the anti-corruption agency, and therefore, everybody knows he's a crook, but he controls all the levers of power, so he can get away with it. Anyway,
Norman, you just faded.
Yeah, I think the Prime Minister didn't like what he was saying, and so he cut the bandwidth there or something.
Norman just did, there you are.
Groups making a difference is it's been around for
Well, Dharma just became inaudible for a while.
okay.
And
Am I audible now? Hello.
now we got you now. Almost. Go ahead and try it again.
Okay, all right. Anyway, to cut it short, basically one big issue affecting Malaysia is corruption in high places. And one group that's grown up over the last few years is a movement called Bersih, which means clean. and it's non-political in the sense that it's not aligned to any political party, and it has managed to get hold major rallies which involving hundreds of thousands of people, and that's placed a pressure upon the government, or at least on public opinion, so that corruption in high places has become a major talking point among the people. So to me, that's one example of how local groups can make a difference. And yeah, I'm done.
In 180, he's got this great sentence: political activity on the local level could also be directed to modifying consumption, developing an economy of waste disposal and recycling, protecting certain species, and planting a diversified agriculture and the rotation of crops. What do you suppose he means by modifying consumption? That was the one that stood out to me. Seems like throughout this and other.
Well, we use Izzy sparkling water that's organic and uses raw sugar. It's taken years to break the stranglehold of Coca-Cola. I mean, I think there's a lot going on in food systems and food production that is trying to alter forms of consumption. I understand when, and I think that includes movements, at least in some parts of the states, towards local gardening as well.
All right. He seems to be calling for a new kind of consumption practice, both here and in the economic section, which we'll get to in a little bit. Anyone else have some clarity on what he means by modifying consumption?
Karen here. When we talk about recycling, it always used to be talked about in a triangle of reducing what you use as number one, not just recycling, putting everything into the recycle bin, but actually starting with reducing what you can purchase in the first place, reusing what you can, and then recycling as part of that whole process. So I think that he's talking about reducing and thinking about what we consume, and thinking about reducing and thinking about alternates to supermarket shopping and growing our own food and etc. Over.
If we think about the consumption of fossil fuels, one encouraging sign is that the voices are growing louder for a carbon tax. Last June, there was a letter signed by CEOs of 6 major oil companies that was sent to the Secretary General of the UN and to all of the governments around the world, at least according to the news release, calling for a social price on carbon. Now, that could be implemented through a carbon tax, as we know, or perhaps a cap and trade system and so on. But to me, it's significant that energy companies are stepping up. Now, they are doing it, of course, not out of some newfound altruism and concern for the common good, but they state plainly in their news release or their letter that this is necessary for them to be able to do planning under more stable conditions. Nevertheless, I think that would do a lot to reduce consumption, at least in the energy. I mean, that's That's not only ecological economics, it's neoclassical economics, that if you want less of something, you tax it. If you want more of something, why you subsidize it? Now, the other half of that is to see whether or not in the near term there might be renewed effort to reduce the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry worldwide that are estimated at what is it, 5 billion, or is or it, anyway, it's an astronomical number that current laws, regulations, budgets, and so on continue to subsidize fossil fuel. That would be a tangible thing that I think many NGOs could get behind.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just in paragraph 171, he actually talks about this whole issue of carbon credits, and but he has a different take on it, and he says that it's actually a way of what shall I say? It becomes a ploy which permits maintaining excessive consumption of some countries and sectors. And I remember working in Sabah when they came up with this whole idea of carbon tax, and the idea was that cutting down of forests, companies in another part of the world could actually pay a tax, and that would save trees being cut down on another side of the world. But what this does is just exchange of money. It doesn't change the patterns. And but it's true, we do need to reduce the use of fossil fuels. But I just wanted to point out that the Pope doesn't actually support this whole idea of carbon tax. I'm done.
Well, let's be clear that what the Pope is critiquing is a cap and trade system, where he's writing about carbon credits, not the carbon tax. They're really quite different. And the ecological economics literature, there is a lively discussion on whether or not selling carbon credits is if you will, a Ponzi scheme or not. However, one esteemed ecological economist, Professor Daly, Herman Daly, in fact, his op-ed piece after the encyclical came out specifically criticized this part of the encyclical and argued that the Pope was misguided. But there are other voices, not only the popes, that are deeply skeptical that such a system could be compromised. So it is a good point. But the Pope is not against setting a social price for carbon. He is against this particular method of implementing that price.
Alan here, in paragraph 190, he says the environment is one of those goods that cannot be adequately safeguarded or promoted by market forces.
Yeah, and in that section, which is section 3, the dialogue and transparency and decision making, he gets at the real contradiction, which he refers to as corruption, and ignoring the environmental impact of various projects, leading to specious agreements. Where have you seen something like that going on?
I think that this is Karen, gives some really good examples of how you can't let the market forces drive these things. And an example, a few years ago, 2010, I was facilitating a workshop that the federal government in Australia had been lobbied by industry to change its a process for the introduction of chemicals, veterinary and plant. Well, in agriculture, chemicals are used in veterinary and agriculture. And so it was a one-day workshop, and they had people from 99 people had written before the workshop saying what they thought needed to happen with this whole issue. And the industry section, so there was industry, there was the health and government, industry, community and government. And so they were the sectors that had written saying that they wanted something, what they wanted done about this, but it was industry who had lobbied saying they wanted the whole process speeded up. So at this workshop, there were like 12 doctors, you know, people with PhDs, and they were there to push their barrow out. 80% of the people who were at the workshop were from industry. There was not one person from community represented, and I'd only been engaged like 2 weeks before this to do this facilitation, and I was wondering, how on earth is the community going to get a say in this? And so the only trick left up my sleeve was to say in the introduction that we need to balance things up here a bit. You know, we had a bit of a conversation about, well, what would happen if this got sped up without taking the community's concerns into consideration, and what about the other way? But I asked people, so I doubled the numbers of people there by asking people to bring the voice of their grandchild, and if they were a man, to bring the voice of their granddaughter, and if they were a woman, to bring the voice of their grandson. And not as a toddler, but as a 30-year-old, to bring them into the room. And it actually worked. Like, there were people who continued, you know, throughout the workshop, throughout the day, they referred to the voice of their 30-year-old grandchild, and it evened up the difference between the male and female, because you know, for every man there was a woman then. And anyway, to me it was a stark example of the local being pushed by industry, and these were, you know, the peak bodies of veterinary organisations and peak bodies of chemicals. And we had, on the other hand, people from the communities, one lady who'd had a heart attack as a result of walking on grass that had been sprayed by the council. Anyway, long example, but thought it was pertinent. Over.
Yeah, thank you.
This is Dave Rebstock. When we get back to what the Pope said about consumption, I'm thinking about the consumption of food, the tremendous amount of waste on the front end, during the processing, and at the back end of the food process. At the front end, huge amounts of energy are used to grow and process food. Then we take it to a grocery store or a restaurant. At the grocery store, we sort out all the food that looks nice, all the produce that's absolutely perfect. The rest of it goes, either it goes to a homeless shelter or it goes to the landfill. It doesn't get composted. Then if it goes to the restaurant, they serve everybody more food than they can possibly eat, so they can charge them a lot. And so that gets turned back and oftentimes gets thrown into the compost bin. Actually, it gets thrown into the landfill rather than composted. So there's a tremendous amount of waste at the beginning and during and at the end of food processing. On the positive side, there's a group of Iraq veterans here that have started veterans composting. And they picked up compostable material from institutions and take it out to the land and mix it as compost. and then use it in community agriculture. But it's a drop in the bucket, but it's an indicator of what could happen if we really consciously dealt with the way we waste food and energy in the processing of food. I'm complete.
This is Jim. In 1991, that'd be 25 years ago, Robert Watts brought together 70 fairly prominent engineers to look at the question of climate change around the notion that it would take a long time politically to figure out, to come to some consensus, and probably they wouldn't be able to figure out what was going on until it was already going on, which just turned out right. But that the engineering profession couldn't wait because they had to design stuff to fit a changing universe. The guy who was responsible for bridges and roads said, in the southern U.S., said, we build bridges and roads to 50-year flood standards, but given the data on climate compositions, those no longer apply. So we have to figure out new ways of doing it. Anyway, that report, Engineering Response to Global Climate Change, is in a second edition in 2013. So there's also been a very, very quiet and widespread movement in the engineering and technical communities to continue to figure out stuff, everything from, refining LED technology to refining the technology in terms of solar stuff, etc. And I'm complete.
And his point in this decision-making section is that a consensus should always be reached between the different stakeholders who can offer a variety of approaches, solutions, and alternatives. I found that a intriguing and provocative sort of statement, role for facilitators perhaps, but I don't know if you've seen the movement where architects meet with their clients and residents of a community before they build anything. I think it's called charrettes. Is an established process whereby they engage people in designing the plans, the architectural plans for what the projects they're about to submit. Seems like that goes along rather well for the Pope's directions. Getting everybody engaged and not trying to hold it down or speed it up for economic reasons only.
I sort of thought the Pope must have put that in there as an invitation to the facilitation community to offer some kinds of forums or techniques or whatever, both through the Catholic Church to all its 3,000 some odd dioceses, but also to join in partnership with elements of the Catholic Church and bringing together other groups to look at what's happening and what's going on and what was needed. And thirdly, I think to some self-examination of the facilitation community, to understand, to begin to push ourselves to think, as Karen illustrated, how as facilitators we don't simply be neutral agents, but we bring a passion and some techniques to a different way of decision making in the context of participation. And I am complete.
Now let's get into his economic sector, political and economic dialogue for human fulfillment. I think, as I recall, what he said was neither the political nor the economic should control each other, that they're both independent, but each has a valuable place to play. He's not beating up on the economic sector like Naomi Klein, for example, because as somebody used to say, one of our colleagues, this is the first time in history when half the world is not starving. And much of that is thanks to the economic sector's creativity. But it still leaves much to be desired. He says outdated criteria which continue to rule the world. What are some of those criteria that the economic sector promotes that continues to rule the world?
Well, one for sure, David Carlson, one for sure is the neoliberal or neoclassical paradigm of economics that has reigned supreme since Adam Smith. Thankfully, that paradigm has been systematically challenged over the last 40 plus years. One of the signs of hope that ties to the Pope is that out of the 300 or so institutions of higher learning that are Jesuit related, the presidents of 170 of those 320 institutions, I'm told, have signed a declaration promising that their institutions of higher education will carry on in the spirit of the encyclical. One of my colleagues is a professor of economics at Regis University in Denver. So he's involved with, to see if his own institution, whose president is among the 170 signees of this declaration, are willing to take the next step. We'll wait and see, but it's certainly a powerful example of where the Pope's circle of influence and the Pope's circle of concern coincide. So let's see whether over the next several months there are some tangible signs within the Jesuit institutions of higher learning around the world to take what the Pope has written to heart. I'm complete.
He has a mantra in here several places, but the phrase in 191 is decrease the pace of production and consumption could give rise to other forms of progress and development. I think the previous mantra is that for companies, you either grow or you collapse. Or as somebody said, companies are either quick or dead. There's got to be another model for what constitutes success.
Yes.
But I became aware of some of this when we went shopping for a toothbrush holder and found 4 aisles in the department store of toothbrush holders. This was an incredible misuse of productive capacity, in my opinion. And the one we finally got didn't work. It wouldn't hold our toothbrushes.
One of the terms of ecological economics that the Pope is pointing to, he doesn't use the term, but he's pointing to throughput. He's calling for decreasing the throughput. That is the rate at which raw materials are put into the production system and process, and then wastes are generated. We have to ratchet that the rate of that entire process down. And this is a cardinal principle of ecological economics, which is competing as a paradigm now with the neoclassical paradigm, which is dominant.
And just as an example, in 2009, we had a group study of a book called Natural Capitalism. No, we didn't. That was something else. This is a good book by Amory and Hunter Loving, who published it with articles in the Harvard Business Review. The book was published in 1999, but it shows about how we didn't use the word ecology then, but that movement can be equally profitable and far more sustaining than practices that go on now. Somehow it hasn't been picked up on or practiced very widely, but it's out there. So there are signs of possibility. Now we're getting along toward the end of this. The third.
John, just to say on the question of slowing down the process of things, you might try a recycled coffee cup to hold your toothbrushes.
Yes, that's currently what's doing it now. But see, that would put people out of work. It's not a simple matter.
Yeah.
Where would all these toothbrush holder makers go?
Well, I think that's another dimension of the story, the economic story that's got to be recrafted. Well, it would put people out of work, both on the side of human beings, a reduced image and education of human beings who could only be slotted for a job, and also on the side of it's used unhelpful. It's used as a slogan that is not necessarily helpful either on the side of moving forward or keeping going what's going on.
Yeah.
And one of these paragraphs I read this morning was about people getting tied into a system that they can't get out of. And it reminds me, what you just said, reminds me of a paper that Richard Maguire directed me towards that was about people in China who worked in a factory that made plastic crap. And what they could not understand, what this article was about, these people saying, I cannot understand why people buy this stuff. So they didn't want to be involved in that system. They were sucked into this system where their job, what they did with their lives every day, was making plastic crap, and it was generated by people who were trapped in the system in the USA purchasing this plastic crap. And anyway, that myth about putting people out of a job is something about systems that don't actually work and that we need to rethink.
Yeah, and
it was interesting to me, since I'm in the U.S. and we're the source of most of this crap that's going on. It was interesting to me that actually this year, a number of companies decided to stay closed on Thanksgiving and to de-emphasize this Black Friday shopping binge, which had felt like it was growing. I think that's I don't think you can ask much from the United States in this because we're so screwed up. But I think that was, maybe something's beginning to happen here in that dimension.
Well, and just to throw in, Australia has just recently overtaken the US in terms of eating the most meat per capita. And we're right up there with pollution per capita. So even though Australia only has 23 million people, we're no different.
Yes, I was just thinking, the whole idea of production should be you produce something that people need. And it shouldn't be to produce something because you can sell it and make it a profit. I mean, seems like, I mean, if you think of all these, where it becomes a system where you just keep producing in order to give people work, but the things that are being produced don't help. So yeah, that needs to be part of the whole idea of how of economy, where you have a the image of service, that what a company produces is something that will serve people. I'm done.
Yes, I've done a little brainstorming on this myself, and it seems like the value we've got to change is away from acquisition as the mark of success towards something like service as the mark of success. And probably the needs that we have these days could be produced by people, but for example, from age 20 to 45, you're in the manufacturing, you're producing stuff. From 45 up, you're in the service business. And seems like that would give everybody a significant role to play, and might minimize the excess production and use of resources and pollution and other sorts of things. But that would take a major sort of revision of our value system, which gets us into the cultural lens. Anyway, that's just a brainstorm, not a model.
John, on the subject of work and the meaning of work and employment and how that ties to reducing throughput, there is some excellent thinking going on by a professor of economics at MIT. I think his first name is Robert, but his last name is Pollin, Pollin, who has written extensively about the feasibility of full employment, and argues for that vision in tandem with the shift from a fossil fuel based economy to one that is run on sunlight. So I have only recently learned of his work, so I can't recite off the top of my head some titles, but do a Google on Pollin. And one side note, he writes insightfully, I think, about the necessity of a blue-green alliance, meaning an alliance of blue-collar workers with those from the Green Party, so to speak. Imagine, for example, a 26-year-old worker in the oil fields in North Dakota who's pulling down $100,000 a year to extract as much oil from that basin in as short amount of time as possible. What would incentivize such a person there to shift away from fossil fuels? And part of the answer, the path that I'm thinking of, is that the revenue from a carbon tax, we need to think seriously about earmarking that for people who are currently making lots of money in the fossil fuel industry. What is that 26-year-old blue-collar worker going to do if he's not pulling oil out of the ground that would enable him to live at that level? I don't have an answer for it, but Pollin is at least one who's thinking deeply about it.
Good, thank you. Going on to the last session here, the dialogue of religions and science. He seems to say both the religious perspective and the scientific are valuable but limited in their scope of analysis. He has a great sentence here: technical solutions are powerless if humanity loses its compass. What do you suppose he means by that?
that we've stopped thinking of a world in which God is our Father and has given us creation. And following all the principles that the Roman Catholic Church has has enumerated over the centuries.
Yeah, so he's remarkably un-Catholic in this, or Catholic in its broadest sense in this, by saying all the religions need to have dialogue among each other. He's not Roman Catholic here so much as saying all the religions have a perspective.
One of our colleagues in the top network, who's going to be hopefully certified this next week, has spent a couple of years facilitating the American Muslim Freedom Party or something like that. And they've launched a Muslim reform movement, which and announced a declaration, which, as far as I can see, really is mainly saying Islam as a religion has to deal seriously with the world we're living in, and not just seriously and creatively. And they're calling on mosques wherever to step back from the self-interest of Saudi Wahhabism that's trying to sustain a kingdom and a power structure in the Middle East around the world. So I think that's a point of that.
Well, folks, this is our time is come to an end. This conversation needs to and shall go on for a long time. What do you take away from our session this evening?
Ellen here. There's a lot of work to be done.
Hear, hear.
I'm complete.
Well, as a new voice in the conversation, let me say I'm impressed and heartened by the level of discussion and insights that have been shared. I feel truly blessed. So thank you, John, for the invitation.
Thank you for being here. You've added a lot.
Hopefully you'll be here next week too for the final chapter.
I certainly will if, well, as unless the creek rises, as you say.
Inshallah.
Yeah. Inshallah. Yeah, inshallah. So thanks again, Jeff.
Thanks for being here. Anyone else? What's a takeaway from this evening or this morning, depending on where you are?
There needs to be a lot of dialogue among various sectors. I mean, that's the main thrust for me of this whole chapter here.
Yeah.
And Karen here. I was thinking about what ICA has to offer in relation to dialogue. That as a non-fundamentalist organisation that has a non-fundamentalist view of religion and an openness to all religious worldviews and other worldviews, and with a commitment to and methods for an experience in involving diverse groups of people in serious and depth dialogue, and with people that we have connections locally around the world, therefore ICA should continue to be useful in promoting dialogue, as Francis recommends, between religion and science and between religious faiths and with local communities, and making sure that those minority voices get heard. Over.
Thank you. I think we're done. Have a good evening. Or
Thank you,
morning.
John, very
Thanks,
much.
Good
everybody.
day.
Goodbye.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.